Hello everybody, welcome to one more video for the dialogue system Unity tutorial series that I am making. Just to recall what we did in the last session, so in the last video we imported a dialogue text from a YAML file to Unity, and we did that by creating a dialogue manager script, and the dialogue manager script would load the dialogue in the start function, and then after we pressed C, each line would start to appear one by one. And as we can see here, that's exactly what is still happening. So we press C and the lines start to appear until it reaches the last line of my dialogue, which I wrote as an EOD, where EOD stands for end of dialogue. And nothing more happens because we haven't written yet any kind of stop or end dialogue algorithm. So that's what we're going to start to do today. First of all, I also made a couple of changes to the organization of the scene. I placed Peter and Holly, which are my two characters, inside this character's parent game object. And to Peter, I added a capsule collider, a rigid body 2D, and a player controller that allows him to move left and right in this weird fashion, as you can see here below. And this is going to be important. Because today, after the end of dialogue algorithm, we are going to also create a dialogue trigger script to allow us to have multiple dialogues in the scene triggered at different times and positions and etc. And finally, we are going to give different colors to the text depending on what character is speaking. So let's get into it. So let's go to our dialogue manager script, which is basically the same as last time. And the first thing that we need to do is to understand how we are going to end the dialogue. So by convention, I usually use this EOD in the end. You can use whatever you want, you can find your own way. So this is just the way I do it. It's nothing, mandatory or something like that. And we are going to search for this EOD here. And when we find it, we are just going to end the dialogue. And the way we do that is first we have to create a variable, a private bool that's going to be in dialogue. So this variable is going to be true whenever a dialogue is loaded and a line can be printed, and is going to be false before a dialogue is loaded or after we have reached a certain EOD. So in dialogue is going to be set true in load dialogue. We're going to search for our EOD in our line. So if our line 0, of course converted to string, is equal to EOD, then we are going to set in dialogue to false, and we are also going to this text display.text and set it to nothing, to blank, and we are going to return so that we don't print the EOD. Okay, and of course we need to make in dialogue do something. So basically we are only going to print if in dialogue is true, like this. There you go. And we will not allow for a dialogue to be loaded if the dialogue is true. So if the dialogue is false, then we can load the dialogue. There you go. And this simple thing is probably the necessary for our dialogue to end. So we now play, and now we start, we press C, and in the end, okay, the dialogue finished, nothing more happens, and now we cannot load the dialogue again. Okay, so perfect. We just created our first simple end of dialogue algorithm. Okay, so before creating our dialogue trigger script, there are two things that we need to change still to our dialogue manager. Well, first of all, we don't need the start and the update function because they are just calling functions from the dialogue manager. And I want the dialogue manager to store the functions themselves, to store the algorithms, but not to call the actual functions. The functions are going to be called by our dialogue trigger instances, okay? And secondly, we need to give some kind of information of the status of the loading and the dialogue to our dialogue triggers. Although we have a dialogue manager that knows itself how it works, it's important for the dialogue triggers to have a certain notion if their own dialogue and not a dialogue is already being loaded. And for that, we are going to transform this load dialogue function, not a void, but a bool. And basically what I want here is it's to return whether a dialogue has been loaded or has not been loaded. So it means that if I load the dialogue, so if I go to this path here, I want to return true. And if I don't go to this path, I want to return false. So that my dialogue trigger knows that if he is trying to load a dialogue, but the dialogue manager has already another dialogue still loaded, then he knows that he failed his load, so he cannot, for example, print the lines of his own dialogue. Okay, so he's not going to do anything until his own dialogue is going to be loaded. And we can do a similar thing with a print line, because we need to know, each dialogue trigger instance needs to know when it ends. Okay, we don't want to know only when the dialogue manager stops printing lines, but each trigger individually would like to know if they have nothing more to give, so to speak. And so for that, instead of here return nothing, we are going to return false, or in dialogue if we want. And here in the end, we can return true, or in dialogue, since it's, well, okay, sorry, yeah, let's return true here, and let's return false here. Okay, so what does this all mean? It means that when I call the load dialog, I can set a certain variable equal to the load dialog function, and its value is going to be true when the dialog is loaded and false when the dialog has not been loaded. And with the print line it's the same thing, but it's going to return true when we have still lines to print. It's going to return false when we have hit our last line, so our EOD. And this is going to be important for the dialog trigger, and we are going to see why now. Okay, so we go back here to our project. We're going to create a new C# script called dialog trigger. Let's open it. And I'm not going to write this from scratch. I have tried to, but I think it's going to be easier if I just paste the complete code here and try to guide you through it. So this is the complete code for the dialog trigger. So first of all, I want to explain how am I going to trigger dialog, because this is going to be highly dependent on game to game. And so it's just important for you to have a notion of how these things are done, and then you can change exactly the way how the trigger is going to work. So in this game, I want to, in the game object where I place my dialog trigger, I'm also going to add a collider. And this collider will have a trigger enabled. And I want to be able to start a dialog when I press a certain key, for example C, and the collider of my player is inside this collider trigger that is present in the dialog trigger object. Okay? I hope that it has been clear. So basically, when the two colliders are intersecting one another, I press C and the dialog will start. And that's what I am aiming here. So the dialog trigger for that, I want, of course, the dialog manager itself, so I can have access to its functions. I'm also going to set as a public variable the player and the path. Maybe the dialog path is something a little bit more noticeable, because of course each dialog trigger can have different paths. I also created two other variables. One variable in trigger that is going to be true when the two colliders are intersecting one another, and false when they are not intersecting one another. And I created also this dialog loaded boolean that is going to be true when the dialog of this instance, which means this dialog path here, is loaded, and it's going to be false when or nothing is loaded on dialog manager, or when a different dialog and not this specific dialog is loaded to the dialog manager. Okay, so here in the start function, I only stated that if you don't set in the public variable the dialog manager that you want, it's going to find by convention once again the game object with the name dialog manager. It's just it's not exactly a big deal. And now I'm not going to go into much detail to this on trigger enter or on trigger exit functions. I don't know if you already know them or not, but basically what they do is whenever a collider enters or is adjacent or touches the collider of this own game object, this on trigger enter 2D function is going to be called, okay? And when there was a collider inside and then no longer is, this on trigger exit 2D function is going to be called. And this argument collision here is exactly the collider that entered our trigger, and here, of course, the collider that exited our trigger. So what I'm doing is I'm going to say that if the collider that just entered our trigger is our player, then we can say that we are inside the trigger. That means that we can start a dialogue, okay? So we are in the dialogue trigger zone. Of course, if we exit the trigger, and by we say the player, then we are no longer in the dialogue trigger area, okay? It's pretty simple. And now I created here the run dialog function, okay? The run dialog function has as an argument the key trigger, and the key trigger is basically, in my case, the key that I want to use to run the dialogue, okay? You can use different kind of keys, so instead of being a key, different kind of trigger. Instead of being a key, you can say that it's a distance, for instance, that whenever a distance is smaller than X, then the dialogue is going to be run, etc. In my case, it's just a key trigger. And when the key trigger is true, so when we press the key, if we are inside the trigger and we don't have any kind of dialogue loaded, then we are going to call load dialog. And here, instead of path, is dialog path. Okay, so this function is going to be called. And if you recall on dialog manager, if we manage to load the dialog, this dialog loaded is going to be true. If we fail to load the dialog, then this dialog loaded is going to be false. And if we manage to load, which means that there was nothing else loaded on the dialog manager, then we can start printing the lines of this dialog. So if dialog loaded, dialog manager dot print line. And also I'm going to say that this variable is going to be equal to dialog loaded itself, because it returns true whenever there are still lines to print. So if this is true, I will not enter in load dialog, so I'll not load the dialog again, but I will still continue printing lines. And when it hits the EOD, this dialog loaded will go to false, and then I can no longer print line. I can only load the dialog again if I am inside the trigger. Okay. Also here, I allow for you to load a dialog inside the trigger, but I am allowing you to print the line if you are wherever, as long as you press the key trigger. Okay. So if I wanted for you to just be able to print lines inside the trigger area, I would do something like this. Okay. But I don't think it's something that's quite important or something that I would really do. Most likely I would, for example, disable the player controller when I start a dialogue, so that you cannot move your own player. And then when the dialogue finishes and this dialogue loaded is equal to false, you can then start moving your player again. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can do. And to end it all, in the update function, I will call the run dialog, and the run dialog is going to be run with the key trigger being input get key down keycode.c. So whenever I hit this keycode.c, run dialog is going to be called. Okay, so as simple as that. We can go back here to Unity, and now we can create our dialog triggers. So I create here one thing called dialog 0. I need, of course, as stated, a box collider, and I have to enable the trigger. And I will place this here. And I'm going to add a dialog trigger instance. I'm going to select here the dialog manager. Player is Peter. And the dialog path is scene0.json.dialog0, as in our last video. Here it is, okay? I also created a dialog 1 for the purpose of this example. So I can create a new game object. I just duplicated it, dialog 1. I can move to whatever I want the new box collider. Let's put it here. And here I will change it to dialog 1. So I have one collider here, close to the lady, close to Holly, and another dialog here, close to Peter. This one goes to dialog, to the dialog file name dialog0, and this one will go to dialog 1. So now I can hit play, and if I go close to Holly and I start the dialog, there you go, the dialog starts. And what's good about this script is that I can go away for her, and I can press C, and for example, he continues speaking. And even so, if I go towards the other collider, I'll press C, and he just completely, he does not load the other dialog, he does not call any kind of function, he just continues with the dialog that is already loaded. And then it ends, of course, and I can go now to my other collider, press C, and he is calling dialog 1. Okay, brilliant. Everything works. This script is a script that can be largely enhanced by you with a lot of different things. You can make a function that, for example, whenever he hits the C for the first time, when he loads a dialog, he also needs to, for example, move to a certain location, and that location is where the player controller is disabled and you can speak to the person while being stopped in a certain position. You can do a lot of different things, but this is the basis. This is how everything works. Basically, you have to change triggers and add a couple of functions if you want to, but the basis is always the same. Okay, so we are a little bit, it's already a little bit big, this video, so I'm just going to end it with a very quick thing regarding color, for example. And for color is quite simple. So we go first of all to a new, we're going to create a new script, and we're going to create a script called character. So this character will be added to all characters that speak in our scenes, and they are going to hold the specific variables of each character. What I mean is that it's going to have, for example, if you want to add a photograph that is going to appear differently from character to character, you're going to place it in this character script. If the color of each character, you're going to place in this character script. So this is going to hold the information that is unique to each character related to the way that the dialogue appears on the screen, okay? And for now, this character will only have a color. So basically, we are going only to create here a public variable of type color, and we're going to call dialog color simply. We don't need anything on the start on the update. We are just going to need to create a public setter variable, a setter function. So we're going to create a public color set dialog color, or get dialog color actually. And this is going to return, our dialog color. So basically we are just making the dialog color accessible via this function to any other scripts, okay? And this is basically all that we need. And we can use this for color, for sprites, etc., 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 okay? And now we can go back to our dialog manager here, and we'll create a new function that it can be a private void, and it's going to be a dialog text color. And it's going to receive as an argument our speaker, okay? So let's call character. So it's going to receive the name of the character. And one thing that you have to be very attentive is that the name or whatever you write here has to match a unique game object that has this character script, okay? And what I need to do is that here, I'm just going to say that, okay, so I'm going to see that game object dot find character dot get component character dot get dialog color and text display dot text dot text display dot color is equal to this. And here I have to go and before printing text display, I'm just going to call dialog text color and the speaker. Okay, this seems to work. So what I'm doing here is that I'm creating this function that is basically going to set the color of our text display equal to the variable color that is going to be set here in each character. Yeah, that's basically that. So you're going to find the character in your game objects. You're going to access its character component, get its color, and set it to the color of the text display. So as simple as that. So now I can go here, I can go to Peter and add a character script and set, say for example, that his color is going to be blue. I'm going to Holly, for example, and say that it's going to be red. Now I can play. And if everything is according to plan, if I start hitting, there you go, when Peter talks, his dialogue becomes blue. And when Holly speaks, her dialogue becomes red. Okay, so as simple as that. Okay, that is all for now. Thank you so much for watching. Next week we are going to basically start to make our dialogue manager script much more complex, as we're going to be focusing on branching and options. However, I think that most of the building blocks to make a dialogue system with a linear dialogue has been already explained. If you have any kind of doubts or suggestions, please leave a comment below if you think that the pace was too fast or too slow. I hope to see you next time. Please support as you can and have a wonderful week. Ciao.